Yektai passed away in 2019 in his late 90s. He had a long, full life, but as I said, didn't exhibit that much. So I just wanted to give a brief biographical introduction before we have a fuller conversation, just in case you're not familiar with his trajectory. Basically, Yektai's life can be divided into three periods. The first, which is from his birth in Iran to about 1944. He was actually a kind of poet by inclination until about the age of 18. And he discovered painting and quickly enrolled in the Tehran College of Fine Arts, which had been founded in 1939. He was one of the first generation of students there. And the curriculum there was a very Beaux-Arts traditional academic training. But he had teachers who introduced him to the modern masters, so to speak, but also to older art. And that gave him the painting bug, so to speak. And what he really wanted to do from that point on was to go to Paris to kind of be an avant-garde painter. But this was 1940, and it was not really the right time to go to Paris. So he ended up in New York via Bombay, Australia, California, and eventually to New York, about a 3-month trip. And so that really begins the second period of his kind of biographical career, in that this is really when he comes to maturity as an artist, has a critical reception that is, of course, linked to the currents of the time, most obviously abstract expressionism. And it goes basically up until the point that he stops having gallery shows in the mid-1980s. So he arrives in New York, joins the Art Students League, trains with Amédée aux Enfants, eventually does get to Paris in 47 and realizes that it's over, at least in his mind it was over, and it was much more exciting for him back in New York. And so he came back and very quickly fell into a circle of artists who kind of could roughly be called all abstract expressionists, and showed at galleries like Grace Borgenicht and Poindexter Gallery. And so this around the 1950s, and I would say that there's a kind of big critical outpouring around 58, 60, 62 in that period, which is where some of the works in this room were shown. And then the last part of his career is when he withdraws a bit from the art world, in many ways like one of his heroes, Paul Cézanne. And he didn't show that much, but he continued to paint, and quite prolifically. And really that's part of the discovery of the work, and maybe something we want to talk about, is how things that happened in that earlier point in his career carry over or do not into the later one. So that's a very, very brief introduction to Yektai. And I think what we decided we would do is we would start with each of us talking about how we came to this incredible body of work. As you heard from the introductions, we're all very different in our interests and our careers and our publications. And so it's actually, I'm quite fascinated to know how we arrived at this point. So I'm gonna hand it over to our panel here, and we can start with our point of entry into the work.
Start with you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Hadi. I'm an Iranian artist living in New York. And how I was introduced to Yektai's painting has a kind of interesting story. I grew up in Iran, knowing of Yektai more as a poet than a painter. I hadn't seen a painting of Yektai till I was 18 years old, probably. But I had grown up reading his poems, probably from age of 9 or 10. Although his poems and his poet books were not so popular or easily available in Tehran's bookstores, but we had like an old book from like 70s that had stayed, like a vintage book that we had. And I remember the first time I saw a painting of Yektai's in a group show in Tehran. I was shocked because I couldn't believe it's an Iranian painting. it did look somewhat a French or an American painting till I read the title. But what was interesting was within that painting, it was a painting of basically an interior still life of a table, but it was also a Persian New Year table with like some motifs of what we celebrate for Persian New Year. I remember that day I asked friends that is it the same person that I know as a poet? It came out this is the same person actually that he's more of a painter, a more well-known painter outside Iran than a poet. But that introduction at the time, I wasn't even an artist necessarily. I was more like a filmmaker getting to know him. But eventually, for the 6 years following those time from my college time, I happened to become an artist, a visual artist, deciding to come to live in the state. And I remember the first month when I was in New York, Yektai was the first Iranian artist I wanted to meet in New York. So I was asking around, is Manoucher around? Can I meet him? And the reason behind that was, I guess, because somebody became a role model for myself as an artist who had chosen to leave Iran and live somewhere outside Iran. We will get to it, but within that kind of my desire to meet him and talk to him, I started gathering more and more information of his work and his life and the people who were involved with his life. I did not meet him, unfortunately, till he passed away, but I'm very happy that I was able to contribute a little piece for our first publication in 2021.
Yeah, I think my story is somewhat similar to Hadi's. So I went to art school in Tehran, and I actually went to the same art school as Manoucher Yektai 60 years after he did. And so I would have encountered his work not in university, but in a publishing house. I worked as an editor in a publishing house while I was in college. And part of the publications that we made were several books on the first and second generation of Iran's painters. So I would have encountered his work as some tiny image in a book. And a lot of us art students at the time were trying to find information that we weren't taught in classes, that we weren't seeing in galleries. I think I may have seen his work at the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art at some point in the early 2000s. And I really thought of him as someone whose concerns as an abstract painter were still very relevant to my cohort of painters in the early 2000s. Like throughout the 80s, 90s, abstraction was still a very kind of vibrant question for painters. That's at least like my understanding of how it was. And then things changed in the early 2000s, but his whole body of work was very relevant to us and also very inaccessible. So then I came to New York, like he did, and I began writing about the work of younger Iranian artists. And I think that, again, through writing about their work, I realized how important the idea of finding your lineage as an artist and a painter is. And I began to understand a little bit of the context. And so in 2021, for the last Karma show of Yektai's work, I also wrote for the catalog, like Hadi. And at the time, I was really interested in thinking about how Yektai's work did and didn't connect to the sort of political context, the social context, the sort of what artists were doing at the time in both of these places that he lived in, because there wasn't a lot of interviews, there wasn't a lot of documentation. That was something that really preoccupied me because in some ways it was still very relevant. Like I look at these paintings and I think that what they are about are in so many ways the conversations I still have with students in the studio, but in other ways they're so removed. And that's still something that I think about. So that's how I came to it.
So I came to it in a very, very different and much more recent way, which was through the first Karma show. And as you heard in the introduction, I live in Los Angeles and happened to be here when the first show was up. And it was a show that a lot of my friends were talking about and saying, oh, you have to see this work is incredible. And there was something about that post-pandemic moment, I think, where maybe after sensory deprivation or living through these forms of both claustrophobia and mediation that opened onto a visual world, but in a very, very different way. I remember just feeling like completely overwhelmed by seeing those works in that space. And my recollection was that there were lots of them, and they were so colorful, and they were so thick, and they were like what you were saying about both being historical and so totally like, these weren't your words, but like alive, or there's just something about them that had a kind of heightened sensory effect on me in that moment. And in the kind of aftermath of that initial, I guess let's say like affective encounter, I started wondering like, why have I not heard of him, or why did I not know about this work? I started thinking a lot more, I mean, and maybe this dovetails a little bit with what you're saying about different kinds of lineages or ways that histories get written or reimagined, kind of they're active processes that are kind of always ongoing. But thinking about the history of his life, but also the historiography of writing around abstract expressionism and certain kinds of paintings that became almost like illustrative stand-ins, or like that could telegraph or communicate certain ideas to the exclusion of many others. So it really led me down a kind of path of thinking about how has this moment been historicized. And I do think in the last however many years there has been a broader kind of, I don't know what word I'd put to it, but efflorescence or reimagining of different kinds of abstract expressionisms than ones that had started to become maybe more dominant. So I'm thinking here of whether it's maybe Katie Siegel or Amy Silman, many people who were thinking whether it was like queering certain narratives, or even thinking about certain galleries that were not necessarily the galleries that were the kind of ones that always got written about, or who got to be part of the stories or the protagonists in those stories. And so actually thinking about him kind of became a heuristic for me for how we as historians kind of can re-engage the things that we think we know, and how troubling his work was to those things, because it felt to me like this all should be so central to that, and why was it not? So that was my initial encounter, and then I was very grateful for the invitation to think further about these, I guess what I would call ostensible or maybe nominal landscapes, which interested me a great deal in starting to think more about them, precisely because I think they are landscapes, but they're also on the edge of abstraction, and it's kind of, where does landscape start or stop, and where do genres kind of go in the 20th century? So his work has been something that I'm now incredibly grateful for as a discovery in these last couple of years, because I think it's been very fruitful to think about in so many ways.
It's interesting that both of you spoke about having a kind of a eureka moment, right? And Suzanne, in your case, is that it was a particular moment in history when the kind of materiality of the painting had a resonance that maybe was different before then. And I really do think that's actually one of the crucial aspects of the work, which if he wasn't showing, how could you see it in reproduction? You just can't see impasto like this in even good color reproductions. And Maida, you, coming from a different vantage point, felt that it was still very relevant for contemporary painting, and you were teaching. And since both of you work on contemporary art and work and speak with artists, but from different, let's say, kind of pedagogical lineages, I wonder if you could speak more about what exactly, coming from your formation, made Yektai speak so kind of loudly.
I mean, I want to sort of flip that and say, one of the things that I feel when I look at his body of work is that he's a person who didn't care about packaging himself or addressing a particular concern or being one thing or being understandable. There's a sort of, like, one thing that you come across a lot in interviews with him is he talks about, I'm after the truth. I'm after a certain kind of, like, he uses words like asil and dorost, which is, I would translate as like a kind of authenticity, or a truth or a depth. And so he's not really talking about specifics. He's talking about things that go so deep to the heart of what it means to see and to take pleasure in reproducing in some ways the process of seeing and light and color and juxtaposition. They're just so fundamental to what painting can give us. Like, you can't take that out of what happens in a painter's studio. But in other ways, a lot changes.
Well, did you think that that was something that in the Fine Arts College was not emphasized? I mean, another way of saying it is, why didn't you hear more about him in the Iranian context?
So what's interesting about, well, first, I guess we would have to explain a little bit about what it was like to go to college in Iran, but I don't remember learning very much in college in Iran. But what I want to say is that at the time in the early 2000s, and it took me a while to sort of understand what was happening, abstraction had a really central place as like what it means to be an artist, not just what it means to be a painter. And when I began writing about some of the artists who came of age anywhere from the 1950s to the 1980s, I started to feel that in some ways, particularly towards the end of that time period, abstraction was a way to deal with highly politicized situations. So you're dealing with repressive regimes, you're dealing with absolute lack of infrastructure, you're dealing with economic trouble, and abstraction becomes this place of like safety. It's a safe harbor. And so you have to think about it in very different terms. This isn't about quietism or retreating from the world, but this is really where the struggle happens to be an artist. And it's also a lot about what people want. Like, people want visual pleasure from the art, and that remains central. So coming out of that setting, it was very important for me to learn that, because it was such a sort of abrupt transformation to come out of like studio and not very much discourse, and then suddenly here I'm studying not art but art history, and there's all these questions about the roles and responsibility of art and audiences and reception, and I have to reconcile these. And it took me a while to begin to understand how a relationship to society circulates within this work, and that's how I also see Yektai's work. I think that he was someone who, from the way I see his work, was very present in the world, was very attentive. And I think his body of work as a poet also really speaks to this. But that what he brings to the canvas is something very pure. And that is a logical continuity, which in my mind, like, I didn't have a lot of models for that when I was being trained as an art historian. And it's in work like this that I see it just in practice. I don't know if that answers the question though.
Well, it raises a whole bunch of new ones, but for instance, in the literature on abstract expressionism, of course, there's this current about what it meant to have this ideology, let's say, of freedom of expression, for lack of a better term, at that particular post-war moment in America. And I guess what it made me think of when you were speaking is that you were referring to it, that there was a sense of authenticity that in the Iranian context was identifiable in these European American models. And that I was wondering if there was any, like, if we were going to talk about the political ramifications of that, what did it mean to look at those models as opposed to other ones?
I think it meant different things to different people. And I think what's interesting is Yektai's last name, the word Yekta means unique. He was really an unusual person in that sense. I don't think it would be fair to extrapolate generationally that they all did this. I think he had a very specific approach to what he learned from and how he came of age. But it might be interesting for us to think through for a moment what abstract expressionism is for us now. Because I think as Suzanne was saying, for the longest time, we had this idea of what it was, and it was Pollock and a handful of other people. And now we actually don't think that way anymore, and that's part of what has allowed us to understand work like this. So I don't know what your take on that is, but I'm curious.
Maybe Suzanne, you could.
Sure, yeah, I was going to read this quote that I found. So there's a film which I would direct you to. It's online. It was from 2017. And this is a quote that he says in there, which I take to be something like a manifesto. So he says, "I want to engage all the possibilities, brush, hand, the edge of a piece of wood, the edge of anything, trawler, spatula, carver, anything that is possible, and brush, and brush." And I was so struck by this because I guess to this point of kind of the way the history had been narrated, and the kind of almost like irrevocability or something, that Pollock was the first, but he was also the last, and he couldn't sustain it, but no one else really could either. Or the idea that, you know, for someone like Frankenthaler being the kind of off-sided bridge between Pollock and what was possible, it had to be, you know, is still the kind of horizontality and the gravity, and it becomes not the kind of flick of the wrist, but the seeping pour. But it's still kind of structurally analogous, and it's still within Pollock's terms, even as a form of negation. And I guess I felt like what I understood by him and this kind of manifesto was that he found in Pollock not a sense of closure, but kind of openness that was so utter, and it didn't have to follow particular kind of studio processes. It was that by Pollock unhinging certain forms of representational art from how they had been understood up until whatever year in the 40s we would pin it to, he saw something open and possible. And for him, it might have existed in a still life or a landscape or a nude or some kind of combinatory logic thereof, or places where it breaks down. I'm really interested, I mean, you could see it at the bottom here or there, like where kind of negative or empty spaces that also become totally full sites of kind of activation of the canvas happen also. But that even within things that were seen as being very academic or kind of classical formats, that you could actually kind of reimagine them utterly from within. And so he could still use brushes, he could still have, you know, fruit on a table, he could still have a landscape, and that didn't mean something that would be anachronistic to him, or it was just a kind of opening of the possible in what's already there. And to me, that's like such a profound recasting of this moment where it felt always to me as a historian coming after it, like it was all so closed and tight and like it was just done. And for there to have been people like him in that moment kind of saying, no, this is just where it's starting, right, but not for the reasons that we generally imagine it to be, I feel like is really remarkable. And I guess the other thing I would point to is just the color and how completely vivid and fresh, but also, I mean, we were talking about this earlier, it's not muddy, but just this sense of kind of, I don't know, like a whole world. I mean, I don't know who would be, maybe Joan Mitchell would be really the only other kind of comparative that I could think of where the color just feels like life on a surface that's also so material, and that kind of play of representation and materiality that's always, I mean, in his case, very literally on a knife's edge, to me just feels like it opens up potentially so much more than like the general stories that we have.
I mean, using the guidepost that you just laid down of Joan Mitchell, Pollock, and Helen Frankenthaler, I just wanted to kind of rest there for a little bit and play the art historian, because one of the things that struck me about the work is that you can see elements of those, but it's very different. There's, and you raised this point before, there seems to be a kind of acceptance that the framework of his painting would be in the traditional genres of landscape portraiture and still life, in the way that Gerhard Richter kind of accepts those conventions of painting as the historical conditions under which he works. And then within those, we'll do something. Also a bit like Vautret, you know, earlier in the century. And while there's color, the impasto and also this extreme jump you have, like in this painting over here, from a blank ground to super, super thick, almost sculptural relief. I don't think you really see that in any abstract expressionist, except 46, 47 Pollock. But that's the Pollock that, the real Pollock. So, sorry? Yeah, Nicolas de Staël also. Yeah. And then with Frankenthaler, I mean, this is also interesting from the kind of his historiographic context. Just as Yektai is getting renown, of course, is when Greenberg is championing, Hermann Greenberg is championing color field painting and the kind of optical mirage aspect of abstraction. And this is the complete opposite of an optical mirage. This is thick, crude, and deliberately messy. And going along that point of technique, I also think Nico and Darius Yektai, in a conversation we had, told me something I found very surprising, is that Yektai's studio is actually super clean. Like you look at these paintings and you think, oh, the studio is going to be covered in oil and tools, but he was actually very neat. And so while he was painting on the floor, because many of these things were painted on the floor with all kinds of tools, it wasn't the Pollock drip splashing paint. It was actually very controlled and composed. And I find that tension, it's chaotic, but it's also classical in a way. It's bordering on the abstract, but it's also working within conventional genres. There's this kind of tension between these two poles that gives it a certain dynamism.
I think in this show in particular, the series of works around the late 50s, I really feel a sense of someone pushing to work something out. I feel like in your essay, Paul, you talk about this idea of like killing the sitter and the sort of almost violence that comes into it. I don't see it so much like violence, although certainly in some of those I feel that, but it's more like, almost like I can feel thinking, like I can feel someone being like, I'm gonna do this thing that I set out to do on this canvas. And because there's so much paint, you really see the traces of that process of like, this is how a painter thinks. Like it's that the traces are there. And that's, I think, part of the energy too. The work has so much energy because it captures an experience over time. The way that a work that is finished and sort of, polished doesn't give you that sense at all.
And you see where direction changes, and you see where the density shifts and the pressure, and. But it's also interesting, and I was gonna. May I ask?
Oh yeah.
I mean, because I don't speak or read Farsi, and on this point of the different genres, though, like if you and I pulled the checklist because I wanted to remember which was which, and like so many are untitled. Some are untitled in parentheses landscape. Some then become called like Pennsylvania landscape, Vermont landscape. So I was starting to think more about like why and when he started giving certain paintings titles that would specify what they were, or is abstraction somehow a baseline? And it did make me wonder how any of this related to what he was writing in these periods, or like how naming functions, or this kind of almost like captioning of action. Because if the thinking, I'm kind of following your logic of, which I feel too, like that there's something being worked out on the surface and maybe not known in advance, but it's a kind of procedural thing that happens to it, and so then the naming maybe comes later, and that's, I'm guessing, I don't know. But I'm wondering how that relates to other writing he was doing in that period.
I want to hear from Hadi on the writing, and then I want to hail Darius in the audience to tell us about naming, if he doesn't mind.
Sure.
And then maybe I'll say something.
I guess to think about his poetry, the way I have explained Yektai's career to myself is that his disregard to the idea of grouping of a movement. Your first question from media asking how come we hadn't heard about him in the college years. The way I think it can be explained is that at some point there was a new movement, the Iranian modern avant-garde movement, where he basically turns his back to it because he doesn't fit in that movement whatsoever. Because all those avant-garde artists at the time were still doing something local or toward their roots or to the heritage of being Iranian, or what was an Iranian could mean. And I guess that turning back constantly happens throughout his lifetime, basically. I even see these paintings somewhat, to answer that question is almost why haven't we heard of him in the last 20 years? And I think it's probably the same reason, because he even turned his back to the art world or to the Abex painters. He wasn't fitting within that. And I think it's the exact same thing within his poems. A lot of Iranians don't know his poems, because even his poems were supposedly after a new wave of Persian poetry, but wasn't also trying to fit within that grouping of new wave of poetry. So to come to this idea of what you mentioned just now about killing the sitter, which I loved reading in your essay and this mentioning. To me, when I was thinking about it, I was like, oh my God, the sitter here isn't the subject or the landscape or the still life. The sitter is the movement. He's killing the movement. He's killing the style of, by introducing the image.
It's the genre.
It's the genre. It's killing the genre. If he's killing something, he's killing the genre. Also keeping it so clean, as you are saying, and so neat, and you're fooled that nothing has happened. But by the reinforcement of image in every painting, something is being happening within that nature. With the titles, I believe that probably with the painting titles, it was something secondary for him. I don't think it was something that he would think about, I'm going to paint X or Y. It was something just to maybe title them or to keep them in records. But I like to think that way, that his relationship to language with the Persian poems or the Persian language was somewhat messing with it. That aggressive sense of something is being handled aggressively. It's almost is happening in a very similar manner to the poems. When I was reading his poems, I have always read his poems, but when I saw his paintings and understood that they were all made on the floor in that position, I imagined that he would even write his poems in a standing manner, looking on the floor, not like in that exists.
Casualness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's semi-casual, but also it's very aggressive toward that material. It's imagine writing the poem on the floor, something like, it's not so poetic, but it's a very good poem. It carries that truth within it.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that you say that he was sort of attacking kind of poetic conventions, because amongst all of us, you're the one with the kind of the best access to what he's doing in poetry. And that's always been interesting. It's everywhere in the literature that he was a poet, and he published, and he was a painter. And the relationship between the two, I think, is still yet to be fully fleshed out.
I have a thought on that, but I still want to hear from Darius about how things got names or didn't get names. Do you mind telling us?
It was one thing that my father didn't give his children, which was his native language. He always said that in case one of his children wanted to be a poet, he wanted them to have one mother tongue and not be confused with, and possibly even not to be confused reading his poetry. He always had this idea of his poetry being something that could be hidden away, like Rumi was hidden from the world for 600 years and then was translated to English, and then from English translated to the world. Right. And that happened relatively quickly. So he was always aware of it's okay to be hidden. Right. So when he pulled himself out of the art world, he let himself be hidden. He knew that at one point, people would maybe come to understand it. And me sitting here watching each of you speak about your understanding of the work from different points and different places in the world is me seeing the realization of what he was saying. His titles were specifically untitled, and then galleries and museums would want titles. And his titling it's like a glimpse at the poet almost, because I remember him walking around a museum when it was hung, the paintings were hung, and he was like, summer landscape, corner of field. And so very specific moments, which is interesting because he left Iran and left poetry as his only expression to go to the West, to see painting and to be a painter so that he could be a poet in a language that was universal. So then to then title something specifically and just pick out a corner of it, to me was, I thought, a very beautiful way. It's like just priming your interest, pomegranate, road. These are his titles. This would be corner of field, and then the 95th Street and and the Italian landscapes that we're referring to them as like the Positano paintings. It's like you see the area and the color and the palette, but you don't see a plein air painting of 95th Street. It's unknown. Is it just that he painted these at 95th Street? Is it the palette, like the Italian palette, you can see pretty clearly. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That is so moving. That thing you were saying earlier about how he wanted his children to have only one language so that they would never feel torn between the two. One of the things I was thinking about while you were speaking was this idea of ordinariness. And that's something that, so throughout the 50s and 60s, Yektai worked on an epic poem called Falgush. And the title translates as eavesdropping. And it's a sort of traditional practice where it's like fortune telling. So you're like, I have a question. And then you go out on the street and the first words that you hear are supposed to be the answer to your question. And it's this wonderful poem that is about a group of men from all over Iran who come together to do this Falgush together. And it's really funny because they keep hearing things and they keep deciding, no, that's not it. And it just years go by and it's sort of like a Godot, I can't explain it. And so one of the things that's so lovely about this book is that the language is really the language of the street. Right. And at the time, so Yektai, I believe, began publishing poetry in his teens in newspapers in Iran. And this was before the modern poetry movement in Iran was accessible at all. Like Nima, I don't think had a collected book of poems out then. So he really was self-taught in the sense of, I think what you were saying, of pushing back against a certain pretentiousness around form. So in this case, poetic form. Like he really chose to choose this very simple language. And in the visual parallel, I was thinking about this quote where he was telling someone, he has these still lives of oranges and tomatoes. And he was saying I don't eat oranges. I don't know if this is true, but he's like, I hardly eat an orange once a year. This isn't why there are so many oranges. I'm after a certain kind of everydayness, ordinariness. Right. And I think that we see that desire to cut through what in another artist's work might be a raising up of something, for him is a sort of, immersion or clarity or seeing directly to and through the thing into something larger and more moving, which I think happens in the poems as much as it does in the painting. But perhaps he decided that the poems were just too limited in terms of audience, which I find heartbreaking, but that's just how migration works, I guess.
To go off what you're suggesting and to mention what you mentioned, Dariush, is that I believe just by hearing that his desire to have the children to speak only the mother tongue or the language that they are living, which is the New York or the United States. I think actually to some extent that was his desire, or maybe I had read it somewhere that he says, when the first time he says the Jackson Pollock painting, he recognizes that that's the language of New York. That's the language where he's going to be, and then this is his take on that language, this is his participation on it, not necessarily admiring it, but adding his own accent, his own truth to it, basically.
Also, maybe this is how he knew he could communicate without the hurdles of grammar, language, form, heritage,
I would say among the Iranian modernists, probably he's the only one who took that Avex painting to this level. And it must have been probably his engagement to the New York life, because he was in New York at the same time and he was here. I like to think it that way, because when he started making abstract paintings, he was not making abstract paintings from the birth or from the young age. It's a conscious decision. It's his willingness to say, I'm going to be here, I'm going to be fit within this circle. It's not to be fit within the group, but it's the language of American modern painting at the time, probably.
That's an interesting way to turn it on its head, to think of abstract expressionism as a local ethnic vernacular. He's like, I gotta do it the American way now. This is how New Yorkers are. These cute little local things, accents. He took it much further.
I wonder if we should, at this point, open the floor, because we have some time. I'm sure there's probably some questions.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. I actually identify very much with trajectory of Hadi and Medya. I'm also Iranian, and I saw Yektai's work in Family's Home, and then, as Medya said, later on, when there was this reform government and the Museum of Contemporary Art opened its door to waves of modernists, then I could see that in public spaces, and I was fascinated by his work. And it's a great opportunity. I'm really grateful to Karma Gallery to bring all these works together and these wonderful scholars. Thank you for this conversation. I am mostly fascinated by Yektai's still life paintings, and I really appreciate that you brought up the ordinariness and the importance of it, and this fact that he wants to approach the actuality of the work. And I want to bring that into conversation with his landscapes, and I very much enjoyed your insights, very much enjoyed Susan's insights that even the spaces where it's bare, the surface is working and it's active. When it's full, it's again the same dynamic. And I want to go back to Paul's insightful comment about the materiality. And I want to know, what do you think? I want to think with you that some of his landscape paintings very much look like his still lifes. And you mentioned that materiality and the surface probably is something that distinguishes his landscapes and the surface of his painting from the like of Pollock and his fellow abstract expressionists. What do you think about landscape's ordinariness and the way he's applying paint on the surface that is opening up a new path, and the relationship that he establishes between still life, ordinariness of that, and also the landscapes that he paints?
No, that's a great question. And we don't have any still lives here, but if you look at the catalog, when you do that, you'll actually see that actually sometimes the still lives, as you said, look like landscapes and vice versa. And my first reaction is that that's him channeling his inner Cézanne, because the artist who's historically where the landscape and the still life genres collapse is really in Cézanne. And yeah, I guess ordinariness in the kind of sense of an everyday perception, rather than, let's say, the kind of high moment of a narrative painting. You know, there's something, and the fact that you do it all the time, and that each time it's a new experience, which is why there's no still lifes by Cézanne that are exactly the same, because each one, even if it's apples and bottles all over and over again, for him it was a kind of rediscovering experience each time. He even just laid down a brushstroke, and that changed the whole composition. Now, I don't know, I would have to look at more Yektai still lives to see if he had that same kind of approach. Was it for him that each time he put a mark down that dramatically changed everything, so he needed time to either rework it or add more? Technically, I'm interested, because if you put this much oil on canvas, it will take a very long time to dry. And unless they've been incredibly well conserved, after the fact, it seems to me that you would expect more cracking in these paintings from having so much paint on them, but they seem remarkably stable. That's a question. But yeah, I think that once again he's engaging with a certain historical tradition. Yeah.
Can I add something to that question also? To me, I see that his approach is exactly the same if he's painting a portrait, a family member, a nude person, a landscape, or a lifestyle. I think what he's doing is, and probably has mentioned this, or maybe I'm making it up, but is finding that truth of what painting can do for an image on the plane of canvas. And I think it's so beautiful to even think it to that extent. It's all ordinary, none of this matters. It's just that painter adding something to this world by that approach of I am making something that didn't exist probably, even it's after Matisse. I mean, he's adding to the Matisse approach to that style of painting.
I think Cezanne is a really good reference. It is about the materiality in the sense that, like, I look at that one, and I think one thing that's happening very strongly is a collapsing of the depth of the image, which is a classic Cezanne move, which we associate with like him introducing, like it all comes up against the surface suddenly. Your eye goes from the emptiness of the canvas to the depth of that hill to the top of that sky, and they all feel close and yet far away.
Right.
And that's, for me, part of the pleasure, that I see distance and yet I don't see distance.
Right.
I think he's working with that so confidently, like he's invoking that so well. And I think with these, it's a little bit different. Like I wouldn't feel as confident talking about what recedes and what comes to the foreground, but especially as you move farther back away from the painting, there's so much to be kind of solved visually with the work, which is, I think, part of what he's doing with landscape specifically. But it's also an open question. Like we have this, these are all our takes maybe, and you might have yours.
But I also think it is hard without the comparative visually in this space, because when I was starting to, I know this is a show kind of about landscape, but at every moment it seems that he was doing all of these things, maybe not like actually simultaneously, but kind of ricocheting almost or moving between. And so how one kind of became legible as one of these categories or something else, I feel like is such an interesting kind of like visual but also philosophical problem, that it seems like each one of these iterations or instantiations, it's a whole world. And then what is that world that you've just kind of brought into existence?
A question?
Hello, my name is Francine. I'm an artist. So this is a comment of an artist. When I enter this show, it's fascinating because it's unseen and it's very good. So it makes you think. So first I thought of Soutine when I entered the show. Then when I turn around, I arrived to this room. Those empty space, as you name them, made me think of Nicolas de Stael. And then this series made me think of John Mitchell. So I'm trying to figure out why I'm getting these impressions. And I saw those three artists looked for a high energy of using landscape and nature with, not to say violent energy. So I thought it's an attempt to find a peaceful something inside a very high and violent energy. That was my feeling.
I totally agree with you. When I walked through the show and I reached these in the back, which I think are from the 80s, right? Like these are later than these.
They're later, yeah.
I really had a sense of like someone having resolved something. Like you're working it through and then you're like, this is what it is. I have it now. And I don't know if that's true, but I definitely, I felt the same thing.
Because you can see there's something fast to achieve, and that's very difficult to do, to go fast and keep a very high energy.
There's also such a balance to those.
Yeah.
Also, like one thing that I always notice about Yektai's work is the way he has a particular self-conscious relationship to the edge of his canvases. Like particularly with those, I feel like he takes it and then he stops at the edge. Like it's almost like when you see these calligraphy masters and it's the perfect stroke. It's like he has his perfect strokes at that point. Something has been like achieved.
Balance. Also the color are very soft. The color are not violent at all. So
That's
that
true.
helps.
Maybe we should end it there? Or? Okay, great. Thank you.